Hello there, good evening, and welcome to the Jim Bohannon Show from Westwood One Radio. We are at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. Online, you'll find us at jimbotalk.net and at jimbohannonshow.com, and you can follow me on Twitter at JimboTalks. Friday, September 1st, will make 1 week since Harvey hit Texas as a Category 4 hurricane. America has seen the images and found the stories from those inundated by record rainfall and historic flooding. For many, the problems are just beginning. Here's a look back at the past week and one of the most significant weather events in our nation's history.
Harvey is expected to keep strengthening in the Gulf of Mexico.
Between 5 and 10 inches of rain with the potential for double.
Governor Greg Abbott has declared a state of disaster in 30 counties.
Right now, there is no need to panic.
10 to 15 inches near the coast with isolated 20 inches.
Hurricane strength begins at 74 miles an hour.
I'm thinking sometime after midnight Friday night.
It is getting more and more serious.
Warnings, preparations, and evacuations along the Texas coast as Hurricane Harvey moves closer.
Highways in Texas filled with cars.
Texas is about to have a very significant disaster.
There's now a supply disruption in gas.
Sustained winds have started to pick up, as has the rain.
We wish you'd put your Social Security number on your arm if you're going to stay here.
The president will spend the weekend monitoring the storm.
With every minute that goes by, the wind levels here just get that much more stronger.
Texas, this is a landmark event. You could not dream this forecast out.
We saw children crying in parents' arms as they were brought to dry land.
We're trying to get to people, and we're just trying to get everybody out of here safely right now.
And every time I dialed 911, it automatically hung up.
The worst part was a few minutes before we were rescued and we were under a tornado warning.
The weather forecast going forward, it's almost a worst-case scenario.
There could be 40 or 50 inches of rainfall.
42 more shelters on standby.
Thank God that there's nice people out there that's helping.
We are with you today, we are with you tomorrow, and we will be with you every single day.
The Marine Corps will be sending 700 Marines.
We're just kind of taking it day by day right now.
We see friend helping friend, neighbor helping neighbor, and stranger helping stranger. And together, we will endure and we will overcome.
Certainly, we thank all of our correspondents for their reporting. We pray that things get back to normal soon, but they're not quite back to normal yet. Despite sunshine in Houston and some water receding, Houston's police chief was telling residents who evacuated not to go home. Live wires and infrastructure issues still pose threats. Governor Greg Abbott says the worst is not yet over for southeast Texas. Meanwhile, the entire city of Port Arthur is underwater, and police are asking for volunteers with boats. Here's Kristen Holmes.
It's been 6 days since Hurricane Harvey made landfall in Texas, and rescue efforts continue across much of the devastated area. Helicopters canvassing Beaumont, Texas Thursday for those still trapped. In some areas, the floodwaters have begun to recede, allowing crews to conduct door-to-door searches, and some residents have been able to return home for the first time to assess the damage.
When I first walked in, I just stood and looked. I walked out the house to be by myself for a few moments, and tears rolled down my eyes.
Vice President Mike Pence was in Texas Thursday to survey the devastation left in Harvey's wake.
To see the outpouring of compassion and concern was deeply inspiring to us.
At one point, Pence rolled up his sleeves to help a family clean up the debris in their yard. But not everyone is out of the woods yet. Some areas, like the city of Orange, have been placed under mandatory evacuations out of fear of secondary flooding from rivers in the next 48 hours.
We are researching a location now with several of our Corps of Engineers to see where we're at, and as far as the water coming in. We know there will be more flooding. There will be more flooding, no question.
In Houston, I'm Kristen Holmes.
So we will talk some more about this terrible storm and what we have done about it, what we could have done better, perhaps, what lessons we might have learned from the Katrinas and Andrews of the world and Sandys and others. We'll talk with Samantha Phillips, director of the National Center for Security and Preparedness, and also public service professor at the University of Albany. And thank you for being with us tonight, Professor Phillips.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Overall, based on what we have seen so far, and I know you haven't had a chance to do an in-depth study of what we've done, but just based on the news reports that you've assessed from your particular vantage point and expertise. Have we learned lessons from storms such as Katrina or Sandy or Andrew?
Yeah, we've absolutely learned lessons from other major disasters. I think it's very easy to learn those lessons. It becomes a little bit harder to implement those lessons. But I think the response is going very well in Texas. I think the collaboration between local and state government and federal partners is a testament to kind of how we've learned those lessons from previous disasters and have implemented plans and built stronger partnerships to respond more effectively.
Yeah, that was one of the indices of progress that I thought we ought to look at, and that is the issue of cooperation. It's certainly great that we have a FEMA and all the state and local organizations, first responders, police and fire, National Guard, and what have you, the non-governmental organizations like the Red Cross and the Salvation Army, and just people like, for example, the Cajun Navy from Louisiana, just people with boats and the courage to go in and try to help out. The key thing, of course, in this context is not getting in each other's way. So you think cooperation has gone fairly well?
I do. I mean, this is a gigantic disaster, arguably the largest we've seen, and we probably haven't seen it all. You know, this is still a very active response. And the hard part in disasters is when the media start to find a new story and there's not as much attention on it, and the recovery process. You know, the recovery process from Hurricane Katrina was, the better part of 10 years. So this is going to be a long-term effort, and it's going to be really challenging to keep interest and focus and priority on Hurricane Harvey and the damage. But I've been really amazed by the work of government and how government has responded. You know, I come from local government before being with University of Albany, and so I'm always looking closely at how local government is responding. But I think this is one of the first disasters where the community has gotten involved in such a prominent way. You mentioned the Cajun Navy, neighbors helping neighbors. I've been really impressed by this calling for whole community and everybody really chipping in and doing their part.
Mm-hmm. In that regard, we've had a number of calls during the week from people who were interested. They sounded knowledgeable and willing to do what was necessary, which most of them acknowledged up front would be that you must, if you go in at all, you must go in with your own food and your own water, try to be self-sufficient, and above all, try to avoid becoming another victim, and therefore not solving the problem but compounding it. Having said that, I talked to a number of people who tried to go the official way. They tried emergency phone lines, and of course they were jammed. They tried email, websites, Facebook, you name it, any social media. And again, I guess people were just up to their ears in such requests. And they said, should I just go in? And I said, well, some do. Mentioned the Cajun Navy. I said, I honestly don't know the rules here. And given how bureaucracies can be, I said, I honestly cannot say that you could go in with all the best Good Samaritan impulses and not be stopped by somebody that said, well, thanks a lot for coming in to help rescue people, and here's a citation for violating this, that, or whatever local ordinance. I didn't really know what to tell them. What would you tell people like that?
So this is a good question, and it's great to hear that so many people are interested. I think the first thing I would say is this is a long-term event. So if you're interested now, I hope you'll still be interested in October and December and in July of 2018, because Texas and parts of Louisiana are going to need help many, many months, if not years down the road. So if you have that spirit to chip in and do some help, keep trying and find a good way to get involved. I will say this concept of spontaneous deployment or spontaneous volunteering is challenging. I think the call has been made for people to chip in, and I think that's primarily focused at, if you are there in Texas and you are fortunate to not have been affected severely by the storm and can help out your neighbors, that's great. For those who aren't local, it does become challenging as you start to deploy from other communities. So here, in the New York area, if we sent a team down without coordinating that, while we have the best of intentions, it ends up being a logistics operation for the first responders who are working so hard in Texas. So think about, there's already a huge demand on hotel rooms and shelter space. I mean, there's a gigantic shelter operation happening right now for those who have lost their homes or have had to be evacuated. So just think about the demand, the additional demand that you're going to put on the system by wanting to do that. There are some great voluntary organizations that are actively involved, the American Red Cross, the Salvation Army, the Cajun Navy, but they have experience and they are self-sufficient and they're able to, help the problem without being a drain on local resources. So I think that's the fine line. It's not an easy answer, and it's great to hear that so many people want to get involved. I will just emphasize that there will be plenty of opportunities to get involved in weeks and months and perhaps even years from now.
We'll come back and we'll talk some more with Professor Samantha Phillips about the ways we've responded, and we'll issue some grade cards from a person uniquely qualified to do so. Samantha Phillips is the immediate past director of emergency management for the city of Philadelphia. She was integral in that city's response to several citywide emergencies, many of which received presidential disaster declarations, including 2012 Superstorm Sandy, 2011's Hurricane Irene, and Tropical Storm Lee, also from 2011, in addition to major snowstorms, record flooding events, and the fatal Amtrak 188 derailment back in 2015. She is also responsible for public safety coordination for major special events and is a current member of FEMA's National Advisory Council. We're at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. We'll talk some more about the Harvey response in just a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show as we examine the response to Hurricane Harvey, and now Tropical Storm for Life, it would seem, Harvey. Vice President Mike Pence has traveled to the storm-stricken portions of Texas, in particular the Corpus Christi area, which was the point of initial landfall for Hurricane Harvey.
We expect Congress to move quickly on the initial legislation, and we'll be working very diligently in the opening weeks of Congress to accomplish that. But let me say we're very confident that members of Congress in both political parties appreciate the historic nature of this storm and understand the enormous burden that it's placed on families and communities here in Texas, and we anticipate strong and bipartisan support for that measure.
Harvey is projected to be one of the most expensive natural disasters in U.S. history. Two estimates have put total losses, including property damage, lost wages, and disrupted business, at as much as $75 billion. We're talking with Samantha Phillips, who is a professor of public service at the University of Albany, director of the National Center for Security and Preparedness. And that was one of the other ways I think we can measure the response, just frankly, cold, hard cash. It's true that you don't solve any problem by throwing money at it, but targeted money is essential to solving a lot of problems. Are we funding such disaster recovery sufficiently?
Yeah, I think that Congress has showed historically that they ultimately will pass, bipartisan measure to support disaster response. I know that there's been some comparison to the Superstorm Sandy funding and who voted for what and how did that get held up. But, I really hope that this is, I just heard Vice President Pence's comments that, he's hopeful as well. And I think everybody needs to get on board with disasters, should be apolitical. They clearly show that they don't respect any kind of boundaries, whether it be politics or race or class or ethnicity, you name it. They are equal opportunity. And I think that elected leaders in the United States should respond accordingly and do the right thing to help those who need to help. It's complicated because, it's important that we provide aid and make sure that the Disaster Relief Fund, which FEMA uses to help communities rebuild and help state and local government rebuild. However, we have to have a really thoughtful conversation about how do we rebuild, and are we continuing to rebuild in areas that are most vulnerable to disasters, and very tough conversations to have. For those who have ever been in conversations at the local level about buyouts and eminent domain and rethinking how cities and local communities are structured, it's incredibly challenging. But this is the time. We're rebuilding in very risky areas. Some might even say this is not per se a natural disaster, but a disaster, a weather event that's been really compounded by how we've managed our built environment.
Well, that was another thing that I wanted to bring up, quite frankly, was the issue of what I call hard choices, and that is that no matter where you go, you can find examples of just what you mentioned. Along the Atlantic coast, of course, we build condos virtually at the water's edge, and it wouldn't take much of a storm to render those uninhabitable and perhaps even death traps. Going back to Katrina and Ward 9, many have said that Ward 9 should just never have been built in, and that now the people there should be relocated, and it should be allowed to return to water, or at the best wetlands. Likewise in Houston, I've heard that some of their flood control measures date back to the 30s, that they're entirely inadequate, and that in areas which should have been set aside, according to some at least, should have been set aside for reservoirs, they became sites of new subdivisions. And of course, a city that big and that grows that fast, people have to have a place to live, and often we will go for the quick, easy solution and ignore long-term circumstances. So what are your thoughts about hard choices that might make future such preparation better?
I completely agree. And I think, recovering from disasters is complicated enough, and to then take the time, and it's complicated, and it takes an incredible amount of time. And that's just to build back to what it looked like the day before the disaster happened. And so, it's very challenging for communities and elected leaders to think about making a longer-term investment in some smarter choices. You name it. There are financial obstacles. There are cultural obstacles. I mean, and at the end of the day, these are people's homes. These are people's communities. And in some cases, these are, generations of families who have lived in the same house, if the same block. So there's a lot of kind of emotional connection to these communities. And it could just be the way we talk about disaster recovery. Maybe it's not disaster recovery, and maybe it's not rebuilding. Maybe what we need to be saying moving forward is redesigning, really rethinking what communities look like post-disaster, so we don't just keep rebuilding and making the same mistakes and making people more vulnerable. We've had 100 and 500-year floods at the rate of, at least every decade, if not more frequently than that. So clearly there's something happening from a weather perspective. And I think now is the time to be innovative and be creative and make those hard choices as you've described. And so, I think my message here would be, let's talk about redesigning. Let's just not talk about rebuilding, but let's talk about redesigning.
1-866-50-JIMBO is our number, 1-866-505-4626. Samantha Phillips is a professor of public policy at the University of Albany, director of the National Center for Security and Preparedness. She has an extensive background in emergency preparedness. We'll talk some more and include your calls in just a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. We are talking with Professor Samantha Phillips of the Public Service Department at the University of Albany. She is also director of the National Center for Security and Preparedness, and in addition is a current member of FEMA's National Advisory Council. Let's just stop off at that particular part of your impressive resume. As a member of the FEMA National Advisory Council, what do you plan to tell them based on what you've seen so far? And I'm sure your final report will involve much more extensive research and review, but based on what you've seen so far, is that going to be a positive or a negative review?
Yeah, very positive. I mean, the National Advisory Council is a 3-year appointment. I'm actually wrapping up my 3-year term there, and it's been a really great opportunity to share recommendations with the Federal Emergency Management Agency. But I think with regards to Harvey, they are doing a great job. And then this is a huge disaster. Administrator Brock Long is fairly new at his post. He was just confirmed in late June. So to have a disaster of this magnitude within 2 months of taking the helm at FEMA is quite remarkable. And he's doing a really phenomenal job. I mean, he's very capable, very experienced, has some time at state government, which is very helpful, and even in the private sector. So I think that, again, this as challenging as it's been to watch and to see the news unfold and watch the rescues and unfortunately watch the news stories about the fatalities that have occurred, in some regards, this is the easiest part. I know that might seem like a crazy idea, but the recovery process, the rebuilding or the redesigning process that I mentioned, that's really going to be more complicated. So this is a long-term project for FEMA, but I really think that they're off to a very good start. And I can't say enough about the state of Texas and their emergency management program. I happen to know the director there and know the leaders both within the city of Houston and Harris County within where Houston resides, and very strong and capable emergency management programs, and that's showing. I think the way they've prepared, the way they've trained and exercised for an event just like this is proving to be of a great benefit to them.
A couple of choices that were made in Houston are worth noting. The mayor, first of all, told Houstonians to shelter in place, chose not to try an evacuation. And frankly, I'm not sure how long it would take to evacuate a metro area of 5 or 6 million people. But if you really focused really, really hard and devoted all kinds of resources, I suppose you might more or less empty out such a region in maybe a week. And then, of course, the next question would be, and put them where? Frankly, although he's gotten criticism, most of what I've heard would indicate that there wasn't much of a choice.
Yeah, he has gotten some criticism, and I think you've summed this up perfectly. That is, if I dare say, that's the emergency management community's wicked problem. It's incredibly complex. There are a variety of different perspectives, and you're right. So evacuating a major metropolitan area, even on a beautiful Tuesday, at rush hour, is complicated. Imagine doing that during a disaster when your resources are constrained, when you have a forecast with a lot of uncertainty to it, and also some experiences with evacuating that have been challenging. I think some people want to dismiss the challenges that with Hurricane Rita back in 2006, but those are challenges that are worth noting and not just brushing off as an anomaly or a one-time event. Evacuation is really hard. Major metropolitan areas, in excess of 2 million people, are really difficult. People rely on public transportation. They don't have access to private vehicles necessarily. And you're right. Where are they going to? There has to be a receiving community on the other end of that evacuation. And you've seen City of Dallas step up and provide some mega sheltering capabilities. But, we're talking millions of people. So it's a lot more complicated than we all think. And it's very easy to kind of Monday morning quarterback and critique at this stage in the game. My recommendation to everybody would be hold your criticism. There's going to be plenty of time to review every situation and comment, and there will probably be a blue ribbon commission similar to the 9/11 commission and the analysis that was done post Katrina for Hurricane Harvey, and I think we owe it to the people making those really tough decisions to see, to let this play out and do some really good research that we can then try to adapt for similar situations.
Indeed. I want to get a call before the break here, but before we go to that call, the other area of controversy that I can recall from the initial days of Tropical Storm Harvey was the decision by the Army Corps of Engineers to open up some dams. This was designed to relieve pressure on flooding in downtown Houston, but a side effect, if you will, collateral damage, as it I suppose might be put, was that some neighborhoods got additional flooding. Now, I'm in no position to assess the cost benefit of all of this. I know that life's choices often don't fall along the good or bad parameter, but bad or worse, and in that case, of course, rational people always choose bad to avoid worse. But I'm wondering if you know anything more about the decision to open those dams.
I don't know specifically about that decision. I was involved in a very similar situation in Philadelphia. Every time we have a major storm and significant rainfall, there are some dams upriver from us, and there's often a healthy debate about, whether to open those dams and relieve some pressure. This is the business of sort of risk analysis and kind of assessing the hazards. And difficult to do, but if you have a higher population in one community, perhaps that hasn't evacuated, and it might be easier to do some targeted messaging in a smaller community and even help with an evacuation ahead of the release of that dam. That's probably the decision making that was that contributed to, or the factors that contributed that decision. It's really just sort of a size and scope conversation at that point.
Let's take a call from Doug in Marquette, Michigan, for Professor Samantha Phillips, Director of the National Center for Security and Preparedness. Hello, Doug.
Hey, thanks, Jimbo. You know what? I completely agree with Samantha. People need to hold off on criticism. There are people that are making really tough decisions now. It's a tough situation. My experience is not related to this directly. However, I was a navigator in the Coast Guard for several years up in Alaska, and I know we'd get calls, and we'd have to do search and rescues, and sometimes it'd take us like 2-3 hours just to get out there, and then I'd be up for like literally up for 36 hours during search patterns to try and find something, and sometimes all we would find is a cooler floating, and I know these guys, they really care. They care a lot. I've heard the Coast Guard is getting like 1,000 calls an hour. And like Samantha said, people need to hold off on criticism. Opening up the dams is a really tough choice too. But, I think they're looking at the bigger picture and what is better for everybody. And it is a really, really, really horrible situation. And I think the people that are in charge, the Coast Guard, the Corps of Engineers, I think they're doing a very good job.
All right. Samantha, your thoughts?
Yeah, Doug, well, thanks for calling in, and thanks for your service at the Coast Guard. I'm glad you mentioned the Coast Guard. What an incredible organization, and I think they've not only received thousands of calls, they've also made thousands of rescues. I think the last number I saw was in excess of 3,000 rescues that they've made. And you're right, it's really easy for watching the news and seeing how horrible this is to kind of make a judgment and want to have an opinion on how things are going. But, these are the tough decisions, and, not everybody's cut out for a job as a first responder or as a local elected official making these tough calls or an emergency manager. But you're right. It's just sort of an evaluation of threat and risk and trying to make the best decisions in the absolute worst of circumstances. And the first responders have proven that they are the most dedicated group of individuals that we have in this country, and we owe them a lot of gratitude.
We'll come back with some more for our guest, Professor Samantha Phillips, Director of the National Center for Security and Preparedness. 1-866-50-JIMBO is our number, and we'll talk more about Harvey, the aftermath, in a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show as we talk with Samantha Phillips, Professor of Public Service at the University of Albany, Director of the National Center for Security and Preparedness, and currently a member of FEMA's National Advisory Council. She has a number of prior roles in various local and other level emergency preparedness arenas, and has put together quite a career in this regard. I'm wondering, looking back on your career as such. And going into something like this, you obviously have some expectations, some preconceptions and the like. Looking back on your career, Professor Phillips, what would be the biggest head slapper? The wow, when I got into this, I never would have expected what?
Ooh, that's a great question. I have to say, I didn't expect the public to be so interested in this, and that's been quite honestly such a great benefit of the field of emergency management. That there's a lot of public interest in what they can do and how they can get involved, and so I think that's probably the thing that sort of most surprised me about this field. That there's just a real appetite for kind of the field of disaster response and emergency management, and just a kind of general public interest and engagement.
Is it the kind of interest which is casual, or interest that is impassioned and willing to support some of the things we've talked about tonight, whether it be greater expenditures, greater contributions, or greater tax payments, or even some of those hard choices about, gee, it would be great to have an oceanside property, but let's rethink that. How deep, I guess, is this public interest?
There's a lot of interest to get involved, and I think, if I could go back to my time in Philadelphia, I would have spent more energy on focusing on how to tap that desire to get involved. It's really hard when you're managing an incident and dealing with, many different missions and many different priorities, and collaborating with lots of different organizations, to have the time and the bandwidth to focus on that citizen response. And, if I had a do-over, I would have done even more to make sure that we were providing those pipelines for that community engagement, that first line of defense, and really rethinking that, first responders are not necessarily in police uniforms or firefighting turnout gear. They are people's neighbors. And how do we give them the training and the tools and empower them to be aids to our overall objectives?
In that regard, what about those first responders, firefighters, police, EMTs, National Guardsmen, all people trained in varying degrees to do various things? In terms of facing a disaster, in general, do we do a good job of training these people?
I think we do a great job of training these people. I mean, there's always more training that we can be doing, and I think we probably need to do a better job of training these individuals on how to work in large-scale disasters. Police officers are trained for the skills that they do every day in communities across the country. Firefighters are, well-equipped to do the skills that they are most called on to do. I think helping those, finding some training opportunities to help those organizations think about how their skills can be adapted, and also reassuring them and kind of reminding them that the skills that they have make them really good disaster responders and first responders. I mean, they're doing just tremendous work in the Houston area and, Harris County and, other communities in Texas. And my experience in Philadelphia was, the police department, the men and women of the police department, the men and women of the fire department were just chomping at the bit to help. And the more we can do to integrate them and help them think big picture is the type of training we should continue to invest in.
We'll come back with more with Professor Samantha Phillips, Director of the National Center for Security and Preparedness, 1-866-50-JIMBO. Back in a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show as we speak with the Director of the National Center for Security and Preparedness, Professor Samantha Phillips of the University of Albany. And despite reassurances from the authorities, there are reports in Houston that a number of people in this country illegally have been afraid to go to shelters for fear that they will be caught, identified, and deported. Again, the authorities have been pretty clear about this. No, this is not going to happen, but your thoughts about that?
I certainly understand the fear, and I think that I started off talking to you about my position that disasters are apolitical, and I hope that that's something that we can continue to embrace and do so even more so. But I absolutely understand how those individuals must be feeling and hope that they understand that they are eligible to assistance and that they should do everything they can to, get shelter, get out of harm's way, get assistance to help to rebuild their lives. I think at this point we can only hope that the message from federal leaders is that, they're not focusing on immigration issues right now. They're only focusing on the task at hand. And, I think the public and elected leaders at the state and local level have a responsibility to kind of hold them to that. But let's, I think it's sort of, let's hope for the best and let's hope that is the message.
Something that any disaster like this drives home is that no matter how effective our group efforts, our societal efforts may be, in many cases people are going to be on their own more than they have ever been in their lives. What are your thoughts about personal preparedness, such as, for example, every family having a personal disaster plan?
It starts at the individual level, without a doubt. The efforts of government, the efforts of amazing nonprofit organizations, regardless of how terrific they might be, you're right, will only go so far. We all have a vested interest and responsibility to be prepared ourselves. And that's very challenging to do. I mean, if you think about the access to cash, for example, that people have in this country. We've become very reliant on credit cards and other things, which frankly are not great tools during disasters. We've become very reliant on our cell phones, which require power. So in some ways, the advancements of our society have made us more vulnerable. So it's even more important that we spend the time to sit down with our household family members and think about our plan, think about where we might go if a disaster hits. And, it might not be Harvey that hits your community, but it might just be a household fire or some other localized emergency. But it's important that we take the time to do so and get prepared. And it's also important for us to know that the time we spend preparing is not wasted. It's, these are tools and skills that can be used in any type of disaster, whether it be the worst disaster to, face the United States or, again, something in your neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. And if I might put in a plug for my own particular medium, it would be that in many cases there will be people in such disasters who are huddled in the dark with no lights, and they may have a battery-powered radio. Well, good old radio has come through in this disaster just as it did in New Orleans and others across the country. So never forget that. Obviously, this audience, by the fact that they're listening, is aware of that, but your friends should be aware of that as well. And I want you to stay on the line, if you would, Professor Phillips, and we'll talk a bit off air. But again, Samantha Phillips is director of the National Center for Security and Preparedness, a public service professor at the University of Albany, a member of FEMA's National Advisory Council, and a person with an extensive background in emergency preparedness and management at the local and the federal level. All of you involved out there, take it easy. Be careful. Err on the side of caution. And together we can all get through this. So just keep that in mind. And as always, of course, our number, 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. So stay in touch, and we'll chat. I'm Jim Bohannon, and this is Westwood One. Westwood One.